Okay, welcome to video lecture number 2 on heredity. It might behoove you to pull and print this sheet from Google Classroom, where you will need it to do many of the problems we've set for you moving forward with the Punnett squares. Now, most of these definitions you've already encountered in one place or another already. Mrs. Shosha has posted a sheet similar to this with the definitions filled in, but we thought it might be beneficial if, in essence, one of us taught it to you a little bit more slowly. If you pulled that sheet and have it printed, you can continue, or you can sit and watch this at a later point, and I would recommend you fill it in on your own sheet. So I want to start with dominant. If you notice, most of these terms come in pairs, and these pairs they're pertinent. It's how we reference a lot of the terms and a lot of the solutions in the Punnett square problems. They're either A or B. All right, so the first pair of terms we have here is dominant and recessive. So we mentioned that Mendel did a bunch of crosses with his pea plants, and what he found is that for most of the traits he looked at, what he found was in pea plants for these traits, there were two possibilities, and it's important to contrast this with people, where sometimes, for example, like there's more than two eye colors or more than two heights present in the human population. But for a lot of the traits Mendel looked at, there were just simply two choices, as if, for example, everyone in the population had either blue eyes or brown eyes. With these traits that come in pairs, what he found was when these two opposite characteristics came together, only one of the two characteristics showed itself and the other one was hidden. So obviously, the one that showed itself, he referenced, you'll recall, the dominant trait or the dominant gene, and the one that didn't show was the recessive one. For the term dominant, I would define this as this form of the gene is always expressed if present. In the recessive form of the gene, when it is found with the dominant form, hides itself or is hidden. For example, in pea plants, the possible expressions for height are either tall or short. And in pea plants, tall is the dominant gene. So if a tall gene and a short gene came together through a mix, through a father and a mother, if you will, that were different, in that individual, that pea plant will be tall, not short. And that's the definition of dominance. The trait or the gene that's hidden but still in there and might come out in a later generation. You might have heard of the phenomena of skipping a generation. For example, your mother might say you have your grandmother's eyes. This phenomena is what happens when recessive genes hide in one generation and then return in a later generation, when they can in essence, escape from the dominant gene they were mixed with previously. All right, our next pair of terms is homozygous and heterozygous. And these terms are important when you're working the Punnett squares. If you look at the prefixes here, which are homo and hetero. So if we think of the terms homosexual and heterosexual, for example, homo means same and hetero means different. So I think that we can keep in our heads. So a homozygous gene is one in which both forms are present. Now, each of your genes, they are made up of two parts. One part you get from mom and one part you get from dad. So if both those parts are the same, if mom and dad gave you the same form of the same gene, then we would say you are homozygous. But for example, if I use the same expression with my pea plants, if you will, the dad pea plant gives a tall gene or a tall form of the gene to his offspring, and the mother pea plant gives the short form of the gene, then we would say that plant is a mix of both tall and short genes on the inside, and then that plant is heterozygous. Other terms you might see used here are purebred and hybrid. So a purebred plant or a purebred gene or a pure gene is one in which both of its forms are exactly the same. A hybrid is a mix. The word I think I had used in the previous YouTube video was a mutt. If you imagine a dog that's a mix of many different breeds. The term hybrids means the gene has both forms present. It's a mixed form. Okay, we're at our last pair here, and that's genotype and phenotype. Again, useful terms to know when you're working the Punnett squares. So the genotype is what is the gene combination inside the organism. Those would be, for example, homozygous or heterozygous. So if I could peer inside, I could, have my X-ray vision and look inside your cells and look inside your, look at your chromosomes for a given gene. What do I see on that pair of chromosomes? That's your genotype. That's the gene combination. When we're working the Punnett squares, we use symbols or letters to represent a form of a gene. So a big A along with a big A, or a big T with a little t, or a big Q and a little q, depending on what trait you look at. Whereas the phenotype is the physical expression of the gene on the outside. So for example, if an individual is a mutt, right, or heterozygous, on the inside, the genotype of that organism is half tall, half short, if you will. But on the outside, because of dominance, the phenotype would only be tall. So the genotype is the genetic combination on the inside, and the phenotype is the physical expression of the trait on the outside. So a genotype for a tall plant, we might reference that as big T, big T. What we're really saying is that inside that plant, the chromosome, the section of the DNA that codes for height, codes for tall on the part that comes from mom, and also tall on the part that comes from dad. But we simplify that by saying, if you will, big T, big T. Another cross you've encountered was the purple and the white flowers. I believe purple was dominant. So for example, the genotype of a plant could be big P, little p, for example. This plant would be called heterozygous. Its two forms of the gene are different. One form of the gene codes for purple, one form of the gene codes for white. So in essence, it's half purple, half white on the inside. That's genetically. The physical expression then would be written in words. It's what we see on the outside. So in my above examples I have here, the phenotype of the plant whose genotype is big T, would be tall. And the phenotype of the plant whose genotype is big P, little p, would be purple. And that brings us to our last term here, which is unpaired, and that is allele. This is a very important word. If you look at a lot of the definitions above here, we use the word form of a gene, form of a gene, form of a gene, form of a gene. So that becomes awkward to use again and again and again. So when we mean a form of a gene, basically one half of a genotype, right? So if I'm referencing one of my big T's or one of my P's, that form of the gene is called an allele. So an allele, I like to think of it as half of a gene. So another way to think about it is that two alleles equals one gene. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, as always, you're encouraged and welcome to email Mrs. Shosha and or myself between normal school hours of 7:40 to 2:30.